Okay, thank you for coming. We will start now. I'm sorry that some of you have to stand, but it adds to the excitement of the event, standing room only in the back. So I'll start by introducing myself very briefly. I'm Professor Houri Berberian. I'm the professor in the Department of History as well as the director of the Middle Eastern Studies program. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Middle Eastern Studies program, the History Department, the History Students Association, the Provost's Office, and the College of Liberal Arts for coming to this event. I will start by introducing the Provost, who will say a few words of welcome, and without whom this event would not have been possible. And then I will introduce our speaker, Professor Cole, after which you will have an opportunity to ask him questions after his talk. So thank you all for coming. Dr. David Dowell has served as interim provost and senior vice president of academic affairs since June 2013. He has been a member of the university for 35 years, and he doesn't look it, but in many capacities as a faculty member in the Department of Psychology, and also as Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and other positions. He received his doctorate in psychology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So please welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. This is an extremely important and timely topic. I know that's why you're here. There's really not much that's in the news more than the tensions we're about to hear about today. And I particularly want to thank Professor Cole, distinguished professor from the University of Michigan, for making time in his very busy schedule. He's an extremely popular speaker. To share with us his insights. He has a very interesting biography on his webpage. I encourage you to read it, having grown up in France, spent time in Africa. He brings a wealth of experience and about 30 years of research related to the topic he's going to talk to today. I know it will be a revealing and insightful presentation, so I really want to express my deep appreciation to Dr. Cole for making time to be with us today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Provost Dowell. So it's my pleasure and really great honor to introduce Professor Juan Cole. He's been on this campus before, and you must have given him a good welcome because he's back with us. He is a Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and you probably know him best as a public intellectual and blogger for Informed Comment, as well as having a regular column at truthdig.com. He is a prolific author. His most recent book is for sale at a very discounted price outside. It's called The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. He is also the author of Engaging the Muslim World and Napoleon's Egypt, both of which appeared just a few years ago. He has written widely about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, South Asia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so forth. He has a full command of several languages, Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and familiarity with Turkish, has traveled to the region and lived in the region for almost 10 years. So he is very well placed and very well informed in giving us an informed talk about ISIL in Iraq today. And I please give him a warm welcome, Professor Juan Cole.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here at Cal State Long Beach, and thank you all for coming out on such a nice sunny day in Michigan. People would be playing Frisbee and not listening to serious talks, but we don't have very many of these there. I want to talk a little bit about what's happened in Iraq in particular, and Syria to some extent in the past few months, and its historical background. Of course, by that I mean the past 10 years. I do contemporary history. And I'm going to make an argument to you that the general, I think, journalistic and political reception of these events is ahistorical. That is to say, people are not taking into account what provoked them or how they developed. This map has caused a lot of trouble because it's, as with all maps, it's only partially true. But it does make the point that Iraq is a multicultural country with several major ethnic groups, people who conceive of their identity in ethnic terms. And so you have Arabic speakers and you have speakers of other languages, Kurdish and Turkmen. But in the south, that green part, is Arabic speakers who are Shiite Muslims, belonging to one of the two great branches of Islam, who are co-religionists with neighboring Iranians, who are also majority Shiite, although the Iranians mostly don't speak Arabic. They speak other languages, including mainly Persian. The white part in the west and the north is the Sunni Arabs, and up, in fact, to Mosul, which is largely an Arab city now, and which has a population of some 2 million. And it's there, that white part, kind of right now as we speak, is not in fact part of Iraq. It is a caliphate. Who would have thought? And then in the north, where you have the brown part, the yellow is kind of mixed Kurdish and Arab. The brown part is Kurdish. Kurds are mostly Sunni Muslims, so they're co-religionists of the Sunni Arabs. But they have their own traditions. They tend to be more Sufi, which is a mystical form of Islam, or more secular. Jalal Talabani is a member of the Socialist International. And their language is an Indo-European language, ultimately related to English. So the word for brother is bra. You know, it's like the rap songs. You can hear the similarity, whereas the Arabic word for brother is akh. It's not the same language family. So the fact that Iraq is multicultural is not intrinsically a bar to it being a country. There are lots of multicultural countries. California. But people have to kind of try to get along. And in Iraq, for various reasons, they're not getting along. So the multiculturality is being deployed by political entrepreneurs and religious entrepreneurs to form enclaves that are not part of United Iraq. Now, the Sunni Arabs are the traditional elite of Iraq, although this is often said by journalists, and it's a little bit ahistorical, because while there have all along been some small Shiite communities in Iraq, this thing of Iraq being 60% Shiite is new. People started converting to Shiism in southern Iraq in large numbers only in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So, you know, contemporaneously with Tom Jefferson, basically, is when a lot of people in southern Iraq started becoming Shiite. So saying that the Sunnis have been in charge for, you know, a long time is a little bit silly, because that's all there were, for the most part, until fairly recently. But as people converted to Shiism in the south, it was the poorest people that converted to Shiism. Maybe they were taking revenge on the Sunni government, which taxed them and chased them, and so they were saying, take that, we're Shiite now. It's not clear, you know, when they converted, they didn't write down why they did that. But in any case, the elite remained Sunni, I think is the right way to put it, even after a majority of the country converted to Shiism. So the big landlords, the big politicians, the big import-export merchants who dealt with Bombay and India and so forth. And after the Suez Canal was opened in 1869, dealt with Europe, were mainly Sunni, although there was also a very substantial Jewish population in Baghdad, and some of them had international branches as well. Now, Iraq was a set of Ottoman provinces, and the Ottomans ruled Iraq in various ways. They ruled it from their capital of Istanbul in what is now Turkey, and sometimes they ruled the whole thing as one big province. Sometimes they've split it up into 3 or 4 provinces. There were appendages to Ottoman Iraq, like Kuwait, which was ruled from Basra in the south. So you'll see people argue, well, Iraq has been 3 provinces for centuries, but that's not true. I mean, it has been arranged in various ways. And the Ottomans certainly tended to deal with it as a unit. The governor based in Baghdad was often in the reporting line, so people in the governor in Basra wouldn't report to Istanbul directly. He would go through Baghdad. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire decided to throw in with the Germans and the Austrians and declared holy war on France, Britain, and Russia. They had their reasons for doing this. However, we historians, we don't have many perquisites in life. They don't upgrade the historians on the plains just because they're historians or anything like that. But we do get one perk, which is we get to decide what the really big mistakes in history were. So Hitler opening a second front with Russia, not wise. And joining World War I on the side of the losers, a mistake. And once they declared war on Britain, the British ruled a good part of the world at that point. They ruled India and Malaysia and so forth. So they were a little thin-skinned. People declared war on them. They didn't take it lightly. So they decided to invade Iraq. They actually had their eye on Iraq for a long time. From the point of view, by this time, Britain and India is being ruled from New Delhi. From their point of view, Iraq was kind of, anyway, a province of India. Because economically, all of its trade was, or most of its trade was with Bombay. So it was kind of an appendage of the presidency of Bombay, of the British India. And they even thought, it's kind of underpopulated. There were a lot of pastoral nomads in Iraq, and more irrigation could be done. So they thought they had too many, Indians, and they might bring some over and settle them in Iraq. They were going to do population transfers. So they invaded. And modern Iraq is basically what the British Indian Army, because it was the Indians that fought. It was Punjabis and so forth. It was what the British Indian Army could take through World War I. And the British, during World War I, they were kind of frantic because the war didn't go very well the first couple years, and there were all that, like, hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were killed, and they didn't really make any progress. There wasn't anything to show for it. So they started reaching out, to make deals, and they thought at least maybe they could make some progress in the Mediterranean theater in the Middle East. And so they promised the French they could have Syria after the war. They were carving up the Turkey. Then they also, however, they promised Syria to the Sharif of Mecca in what is now Saudi Arabia. They double booked Syria. How if sometimes you go to get on your flight and you find somebody in your seat and know the airline has sold them the ticket too. So after the war, the Syrians said the French said you promised us Syria. And the Arabs said you promised us Syria. And the British said, well, bad show, old boy. And so then the French said, well, we're taking Syria. And they invaded and took it. But the British had given it to the son of the emir of the Sharif of Mecca, Faisal. So Faisal was kind of a man without a country at that point. And the British, felt badly. And then they had conquered Iraq, so they had this country, and the British liked to replicate their system wherever they were, so they decided that Iraq, which revolted against the British in 1920, that it might be easier to rule if it had a king. So they brought Faisal to be king of Iraq. Faisal had never had anything to do with Iraq, and the Iraqis didn't know really very much about who he was. But all of a sudden, the British said, here's your king. And he, of course, being from Mecca, was Sunni, and he needed constituents in Iraq, and so he reached out to the Ottoman-trained Sunni officers and formed a government that kind of locked the Shiites out of power. And in fact, I found an archival document from the 1940s in which one of the few Shiites who actually got on the cabinet was dreaming that maybe someday there would be a Shiite prime minister. So presumably he's smiling from his grave now, although there's a Shiite prime minister, it's not clear that he's the prime minister of all of Iraq. And the Sunnis remained the major landowning class, although there were some Shiite grandees, but it's not that there were no rich Shiites. But the predominance of wealth and power was in the hands of the Sunnis until 1958, when the people of Iraq rose up and overthrew the British-installed monarchy, and Iraq became a republic. They were really angry at those kings and prime ministers who were very pro-British. They had refused to join in the 1956 war on the side of Egypt. They kind of just sat it out. They had joined the Baghdad Pact with the British against the Soviets, and people in Iraq just felt, it was a very unequal society, and the working classes and the farmers were very, very poor. There were a couple million landless farmers, and because of economic inequality, because of lack of development, because of foreign policy, subservience to British interests, the monarchy and the government became extremely unpopular. And I have proof that they were unpopular because they got a hold of the prime minister, Nouri Said, and they killed him. And they dragged him through the streets and then they buried him. And then the next day they went back and they disinterred him and dragged him through the streets some more. So I conclude that they didn't like him. The Sunni rural people are still somewhat organized by kinship politics, what we call in English tribe. The Arabic word is really more like clan, it's ashira. And urban people, don't really pay so much attention to kinship politics. And only about a third of Iraqis identify tribal, that they would, put a lot of emphasis on their clan. Where the kinship politics exists, it is important. And so you have the Al-Bu Nasr and Tikrit, you have the Jubur around Salahuddin, you have Dulaim in Al-Anbar province in the west, you have Shamar in northwest of Baghdad, Tai in Mosul, and so forth. So one of the things we're saying when we say that western and northern Sunni Arab Iraq has made an alliance with ISIL, with this terrorist group, and thrown off the Shiite government in Baghdad, is these tribes joined with ISIL. They made an alliance of convenience. Now, ISIL, and I'll talk about this later, is an ideological organization. It's a kind of cult where it uses certain themes from Sunni Muslim history and practice, but then kind of distorts them. And it has a doctrine of a military tactical doctrine of ruling by terror, of using fear and violence to coerce. So it's kind of like, organized crime plus a Sunni Muslim version of an incipient Vatican. So these tribes who felt very much oppressed and neglected and marginalized, and actually were being shelled by the Shiite-ruled government in Baghdad in many instances, did a deal with the devil. At some point, they went over to ISIL. Now, apparently, some of them are having buyer's remorse, and there's some talk of being able to organize some of them to fight ISIL, to have tribal levies, or what are being called Sunni National Guardsmen. But these are still important units, and of course, the U.S. military had to deal with them. They didn't, when the Americans first went in, they had no idea what the tribes were in Iraq. They gradually angered the Dulaim and Al-Anbar in places like Fallujah. And, you know, they didn't ask me about this, but I would have told them, you really shouldn't mess with the Dulaim. And that's a picture of where these guys are. See, Dulaim is out west. Fallujah and Ramadi, those are Dulaim areas, and so Jubur is up north, and so forth. So this is part of the political landscape. But, as I said, only about a third of Iraqis are rural or identify so much with a tribal identity. Most of the urban people, and there's been enormous urbanization in Iraq in the last 60 years because of oil. Oil brings in money, and then there's money to construct buildings and invest and make pharmaceutical companies and all kinds of factories and so forth. So the oil money was an engine of urbanization in the past 60 years. And people who settled in the cities, you know, you get cut off from your cousins, and kinship becomes less, kinship politics becomes less important. And they were very attracted as they built new national identities and new political identities. They were very attracted by Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism has many forms, but it's a kind of idea that all the Arabic speakers should be ultimately in a single state or a coalition of states, kind of a United States of Arabia. It's, in my view, kind of a crackpot theory because they just speak Arabic. There are 2,000 dialects of Arabic, and they can't even, you know, understand each other necessarily. No offense to the Moroccans. We believe you are speaking Arabic, but we can't understand you. From the point of view of the Eastern dialects, there are outliers. But they have this idea that all the Arabs should be in one state, and for Sunni Arabs in Iraq, that was a way of, you know, identifying with Egypt, the great populous Arab country, which was more powerful and nationalist. And so they became attracted to the Baath party as they urbanized. It gave them a framework, and the Baath party was a combination of socialism, one-party politics, and ethnic nationalism. So it was like communism in a way, but the communists wouldn't approve of it because in communism you're not supposed to bring up about ethnicity. It's all about, it doesn't matter what ethnic group the workers are from, they should all just be united together. Whereas the Baath Party took some emphases from communism and socialism, but it also talked about forming the new Arab person, al-insan al-arabi al-jadid. And so it was a kind of ethnicized leftism, and it had some advantages for Iraq. It generally was a horrible thing, but it had some advantages for Iraq. One was that it didn't matter whether you were Shiite or Sunni or Christian or Jewish, if you identified Arab, and there were, you know, before the rise of Israel and even somewhat after, there were Jews living in the Arab world who identified Arab. And Iraq had a big community like that, which gradually was destroyed, dissipated, and went elsewhere. But anyway, for the ones that remain, the Christians and the Sunnis and the Shiites, and they have other things in Iraq. Iraq is very complicated with regard to religious ethnicity. The Baath Party had certain advantages. So the Turkmen who speak Turkic they, surprisingly enough, they were very attracted by the Baath party, the Sunni Turkmen, and they, because the price of admission was that you learned Arabic, and most people in Iraq did. The Kurds, not so much. The Kurds never liked a Baathist ideology because they didn't identify Arab. So a lot of Sunnis joined the Baath party. It was very popular amongst them, but also Shiites did. And it's been estimated that half of the Baath party functionaries, the lower level Baath party functionaries in Iraq in the 1980s, say, were Shiite. But the upper echelons of the party and of the Iraqi military were, disproportionately Sunni Arab. I don't think the Sunni Arabs in Iraq are more than about 17% of the population, because you have Kurds, you have Shiites, 60% are Shiite, probably 22% are Kurds. So, but they, the high generals and the Revolutionary Command Council and so forth, they tended to be Sunni. And the Baath had come to power in 1968 and ruled Iraq. And it did, it industrialized the country further, it spread education, it was a horrible one-party state which murdered a lot of people for being dissidents. But these horrible one-party states also did do, development work, basically. But by the 1990s, it was all in decline, and the United States and the UN had put very severe sanctions on Iraq, and it wasn't doing well. And then the Bush administration, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear, decided to invade and occupy Iraq. I actually did some consulting at some point because Washington figured out that I had written about Iraqi history, and they called me in the Congress. One time a set of congressmen, senators and congressmen, I was consulting with them. And I swear to God, one of them, a Republican, sidled over to me and said, "Why do you think we're there?" I nearly fell off my chair. I said, "I'm a Midwestern college professor. You're a congressman. You're asking me why we're there." "I don't know." So we'll find out eventually, I guess. But one of the things they did when they invaded and occupied Iraq was to overthrow the Baath party, and they brought allies with them, the Americans, which were expatriate Iraqis, predominantly Shiites, some Kurds, who were their allies, and they installed them in power. You had the Coalition Provisional Authority was the American government of Iraq in 2003, 2004, which, by the way, never had a congressional charter. It never existed in the law. It doesn't seem to have kept receipts either. People ask me, well, where did the $12 billion go? And I would say get a shovel, wander around nice houses in Fairfax County, Virginia, and dig in the backyard. But it was locally, it was very incompetent. It was called Can't Provide Anything, CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority. Well, and that was the American government. Then below that, they established a transitional Iraqi government, which was a transitional government, they made predominantly Shiite. They brought in members of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which had been founded by Ayatollah Khomeini among Iraqi expatriates in Tehran. So it was very strange to have these guys, Ayatollahs sitting on this council governing Iraq alongside Paul Bremer, who was the former ambassador to the Netherlands. The Shiites in Iraq were quite frankly vindictive. And if you compare post-war Iraq to South Africa, it's quite instructive, because when the African National Congress, which had been a communist organization, took over South Africa, they had grievances. The Afrikaner state, the apartheid state, was mean, killed people, large numbers of people, and arrested them arbitrarily and tortured them. It wasn't a nice government. You meet Afrikaners, many of them are perfectly nice people. I'm not saying anything about that. We're all fans of Charlize Theron, but that government was horrible. And when the African National Congress took over South Africa, they could have been vindictive. They could have driven white South Africans out of their homes the way Mugabe did in Zimbabwe and so forth, but they didn't. They did kind of insist on being included as junior partners in many of the Afrikaner corporations. So if you look at the former communists of the ANC, many of them, have the infinities and so forth now. But they came up in the world, but there was a matter of sharing, And then their commission of inquiry of apartheid government didn't actually, take people out and shoot them for war crimes. They made a deal. They said, if you will confess your war crimes, you'll be, the skunk at the party. You won't be able to participate in public life and so forth, but nothing bad will happen to you. And so they went through all of these officers and policemen and politicians and got them to admit the horrible things they had done to the black Africans. But then after that, they left them alone. There was reputational damage. You don't usually invite your war criminal to dinner. But the Iraqis did it backwards. They did it all the other way around. So the Shiites who came with the Americans, the expatriates like Ahmed Chalabi and so forth, they set up what they called a de-Baathification committee to de-Baathify Iraqi society, to punish people for having been a member of the Baath party, which they coded as a kind of Nazi party. And if you were a high school teacher in Iraq in 1992 and you wanted to go to a summer school on Shakespeare in London, well, you would need a passport. How would you get the passport? Had to be a member of the Baath party. So you might join. Now, the Bremer and his Shiite colleagues are coming to you and saying, you're a Nazi, you're fired because you joined the Baath party. They fired something on the order of 70 to 100,000 people for having been members of the Baath party. Not all of them high up, and not all of them having been proved to have done anything particularly bad. And then they brought in Shiites to replace them, their cousins and so forth. This firing of people was made even worse because the economy had collapsed. There were no jobs. There was no, Iraq was a socialist country, so it was a huge public sector. There wasn't much of a private sector. So once you got fired from your government job, it's not like you could go out and get another job very easily. And then the U.S. also wanted to spread the free market in socialist countries, so it just let the state-owned factories and things collapse. The magic hand was supposed to substitute. And I admire entrepreneurs. I think that entrepreneurialism is hard work and it requires a lot of training. And the Iraqis didn't have that. There wasn't any magic hand. And so it was unrealistic to expect that to happen. So enormous unemployment swept through these Sunni Arab areas, Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul. People who used to be on top of society, had the really good jobs, all of a sudden they're on the bottom. And the message to them is the Shiites and the Kurds are now in control along with the Americans, and you used to be an elite, but you're not anymore, and you're unemployed, and maybe we'll let you be janitor. And yes, we'll have elections, and if you want, you can have members of parliament, but it's one chamber, there's no Connecticut compromise, and you will be overruled by every vote from here to eternity because you'll be a minority in parliament. Well, the Sunni Arabs, as we mentioned, were an elite, and there were poor people amongst them, but there were a lot of elite people as well. They were the equivalent of the West Point graduates in this country, and the Harvard MBAs, and the Pentagon chiefs of staff, and they weren't going to take this lying down. And they gave the Americans a little bit of space to see, well, what's going to happen? Are they going to do something good for us or bad? And once they figured out that they were going to be royally screwed over by the Americans and their allies, they decided to revolt. So they formed cells and they started blowing up things. They set improvised explosive devices along the side of the street where they knew that American jeeps were coming. They blew up a Shiite Ayatollah. there were maybe 50 major cells, I mean, with each with hundreds or thousands of members all over the country, predominantly in the West and North where the Sunni Arabs were. And many of them were secular-minded. So there was the 1920 Revolutionary Brigades. That's an echo of the 1920 revolt against the British in colonial times. Those were relatively secular Sunni Arabs. One secular group called itself, very confusingly, the Army of Islam, but they didn't pray regularly. Many of them were neo-Baathist. I mean, the Baath party had been dissolved and abolished, but people had grown up in its framework, and so they still thought of themselves as Arab nationalists and secularists and so forth. And often these were led by former Iraqi army officers, and this is true to this day. Now it would be the younger officers, but they're still active. And one of the things we saw as time went on, however, was that some Sunni Arabs, not a majority, but some of them turned away from secular Arab nationalism as their political identity and increasingly turned essentially to Al-Qaeda. And by the way, I predicted this in 2002. I said, if you invade Iraq and overthrow the Baath party, you will delegitimize secular Arab nationalism, and where will people go? Right into the arms of Al-Qaeda. So, unfortunately, my talk at the International Institute at the University of Michigan was apparently not widely read in Washington, but it was obvious that this would happen. And one of the people who organized those Sunni Arabs who felt so aggrieved that they gave up their former political identity and started moving towards a kind of Sunni Arab radicalism was Abu Musab Zarqawi, a Jordanian. He had been briefly in Afghanistan. And he was originally not close. In fact, he had a kind of feud with bin Laden. However, he came back to Iraq before the American invasion. He actually was cited by the Americans as a reason to invade Iraq. The fact that Zarqawi was in Iraq, because he was, I don't know why. He was coded as Al-Qaeda, but he didn't like bin Laden and wouldn't let his people give money to Al-Qaeda for fundraising. But somehow Zarqawi had been in Afghanistan. I don't know, he knew bin Laden. That was why we had to invade Iraq. And then Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and these guys all told this story that Saddam liked Zarqawi, and the Zarqawi was wounded at one point, was taken to hospital in Baghdad, and I don't know, the nurses came in and fed him grapes and treated him royally and so forth. So that's why we have to invade Iraq. But I found, after the invasion, they released a lot of the Baathi documents. I found this document, which was an all-points bulletin from the secret police, that there's this very dangerous man in Iraq named Zarqawi who had been in Afghanistan with bin Laden, and he should be found immediately and arrested and shake down the Jordanian community wherever it is, because he might be known to them, to find him and get rid of him. This was from the summer of 2002. So all of that fairy story, which you can go back and find in LexisNexis about Saddam and Zarqawi, is complete fabrication. Of course, that was very rare in this particular war. And they were called, the kind of people around Zarqawi were called Salafi Jihadis. Salafi was a movement of Sunni Islam in the late 19th century and into the 20th that said that we've become sclerotic, that we have too many medieval glosses on the Quran, and who cares what medieval people thought the Quran meant, and we should go back to the time of the companions of the Prophet themselves. See what they said about Islam, the first generation. So it's a little bit like Catholic reformism, putting a new emphasis on the patristics and going back beyond, the medieval commentaries. And however, and most of them were liberals. Some of the early Salafis corresponded with Tolstoy and learned French and studied science and so forth. But over time, in the mid-20th century, the Salafis were captured by in many instances, they became very influenced by the Saudi form of Islam, the Wahhabi form, which is, frankly, on the whole and by and large, somewhat anti-intellectual, I don't know what to call it, because the reporters say it's strict Islam, but strict implies that that's the way you ought to do it. And nobody thinks that outside of Saudi Arabia. So it's a particular sectarian, rigid form of Islamic law, but it became influential among some of the Salafi Sunnis. And then over time, there were some Salafis who were radicals and who said, we have to, not only do we have to live a Puritan kind of Muslim life, but the fact that we're ruled by all of these impious people is unacceptable. We have to start blowing things up. So you have the Salafi Jihadis, and that becomes the ideology of the Zarqawi group. And ultimately, Zarqawi feels he needs friends, so he makes an alliance with bin Laden, makes up with him, and declares that he's the leader of al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, the Qaeda between the two rivers. They did a bombing in Jordan in 2005 of tourist hotels. There was a great Syrian director, Mustafa Akkad, who among his works were the Friday the 13th horror films. And Zarqawi blew him up. I thought it was ironic. That was the real terror. They practiced takfir, which is a kind of vigilante excommunication. They would just declare that other Muslims are not Muslims. This is frowned upon in Sunni Islam, but they do it. And also, if they didn't like the other Sunnis, imagine what they thought about Shiites, who they thought were wretched heretics. And they targeted Shiites. They would blow up a Shiite wedding, which is really mean. But in Islam, it's like Orthodox Judaism. You would have the funeral the same evening. And they knew there would be a funeral. They would come back and blow up the funeral. So I don't know what you even call that. And they would blow up ice cream shops where Shiite children were getting snacks. They blew up a pet shop. The snakes were kind of writhing in the street and the rabbits were dead. And the Americans couldn't understand what in the world were these people doing, because it seemed like there was random soft target, what the American military calls soft targets. But it was clear to me what they were doing. They were mobilizing people, because the message to the Shiites was, we're coming for you, we're going to kill you. And they hoped that the Shiites' response would be, oh yeah, well, we'll kill you first. Then the Shiites would start attacking Sunnis, and the Sunnis would feel helpless, and who would volunteer to protect them? The Zarqawi. So it's perfect. He was killed in 2006. And I think a lot of American military people thought that Zarqawi's death would end the insurrection, but in fact, other people just took over for him. It wasn't him, there was a whole set of cells, and they were only one, and they were probably only about a third of the Sunnis were on the religious side of politics anyway at that point. So they continued blowing things up. Under the Americans, originally, the Bush administration was going to install a Karzai kind of figure over Iraq that would massage a government into existence. They would pretend the Iraqis had chosen it, and they would just declare somebody, friend of George, to be president. Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who's the leading Shiite authority in Najaf, issued fatwas against them and said, no, you can't do it that way. Sistani is a very interesting man. He called for, after the invasion, he called for some books on American political science and read through them. So his fatwa to the Americans was that your idea of kind of caucus-based elections is what the Bushis called it, isn't going to work for Iraq. He said it won't produce a legitimate government. And then he said in Arabic, he said, Al-Hukuma al-Shar'iyya munbathika min iradat al-Sha'b al-Iraqi. The legitimate government has to spring from the will of the Iraqi people. He quoted them popular sovereignty from Montesquieu. He took the spirit of the laws and slapped Mr. Bremer with it. So the Americans were for, and then they had huge demonstrations demanding one person, one vote elections, which of course they knew the Shiites would win because they're the majority. But the Bushis were kind of maneuvered into this. Well, but what happened was that the religious Shiite parties, the fundamentalist parties, the ones who wanted a Shiite Islamic State and had been working for that for decades, they were the ones who won the 2005 elections. And I remember I tried to tell people this in this country, that they were, you're young enough, most of the people in this audience, that you might not remember this, but the Iraqi elections of 2005 were an American project. It was vindication of the whole invasion and occupation. So people would send me nasty emails that, you see, we had the elections and it was a big turnout. And I would say, but the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was founded by Ayatollah Khomeini, won the elections. Why does that make the red states happy? I don't understand. And this one journalist called me, they said, now that the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq has won the elections, what do you think they will want? I said, well, let's start with their name. And then they made a constitution which the Sunnis didn't like. Originally, they were going to put Ayatollahs in the constitution, but the Americans made them take that back out. In any case, the Sunni provinces voted against the constitution in late 2005. And right from there, you know that's not a good sign. You know, when a third of the country rejects the constitution, that's a civil war waiting to happen. And the Sunnis were oppressed by these Shiite fundamentalists. They viewed them as a security problem, and some of them were, but they overdid it. They took it out on the whole community. So if a bomb went off in a Sunni Arab city, you know, targeting a Shiite garrison, because most of the army ended up being Shiite, then they would just arrest all the Sunni youth in the area. Well, it's a Sunni city. There would be a lot of Sunni youth in the area. That's not a reason to arrest somebody. And maybe some of them got shrapnel, but that's how they had, the Americans and the Shiite government together by 2008 had 50,000 people in detention centers, and 2/3 of them were Sunni Arabs, and most of them were arbitrarily arrested. They were left there for years with no trial, no evidence against them. Some of them were tortured, and then some of the villages went into rebellion, and the government of Nouri al-Maliki, the Shiite prime minister, started sending helicopter gunships against them and shelling them, tanks against them. A lot of Sunni villages, we haven't been following this the last few years. That's their daily lives, is that their government was attacking them. And then there were all these young men in prison, and when the Arab Spring came along in 2011, the Sunnis, there was a kind of Sunni Arab Spring in Iraq, and they came out and they demonstrated, and they wanted democracy, and they wanted a voice, and the government sent helicopter gunships to shoot at them. Then the Syrian protests were treated similarly by the Syrian government, and many of the Sunni Arab radicals in Iraq and the volunteers from the rest of the Arab world who had come to support them thought there's more likely that they'll make headway in Syria, so they ran off to fight in Aleppo and Idlib and places like that. And this Zarqawi's organization, which had been Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, restyled itself the Islamic State of Iraq, and then they started calling themselves Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And the rest of the rebels really minded their tactics, because what they did is they would avoid fighting Bashar al-Assad, the Baath government in Syria, and they would fight with the other rebels. So rebels would take on the Baath, would kick them out of a town or an army base, and establish, you know, a rebel local government, and then ISIL would come in and poach on them. They didn't play well with other children. And then they wouldn't bother to fight the Baath army. They would let the others do that. So they were an Al-Qaeda affiliate, remember, Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the successor to bin Laden, who's a mass murderer, has 3,000 people's lives on his hands, kicked ISIL out of Al-Qaeda. Said, you guys are too nasty to be in our organization. I mean, when Al-Qaeda won't have you. And then they started pioneering and capturing military bases from the Syrian Baath, and they got the tanks, and they got the medium weaponry. And then, I'm sorry about that. I should have turned that off. It's a joke. My undergraduates insisted. In June of this year, the ISIL had made secretly behind the scenes an alliance with the ex-Baathi officers and the Sufi orders in Mosul who had fought the Americans. And they said, look, we can rescue you from the Shiite government, which is oppressing you, and then we'll jointly rule. And I don't know, people in Mosul hadn't been paying attention to what happened in Syria because these guys don't jointly rule. So they provoked a set of urban uprisings. And the way the American narrative of this is given is that the 5,000 or 10,000 ISIL fighters came down from Syria into northern Iraq and conquered Mosul away from the Iraqi army, which largely ran away from them. That's not what happened. It's true, I mean, ISIL fighters came over to Mosul, but they had made these political alliances with these revolutionary cells, which went back to the days of the American occupation. And there was it was like Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011. Mosul rose up against what they coded as the Shiite occupation army. And they threw stones at the soldiers. And, you know, even if you have like 70,000 troops in Mosul from the central government, if 2 million people are angry at you, that's not really very many. And so a lot of the young soldiers from Basra and Hilla and so forth from the south, they were afraid, they ran away. And then we now know that, you know, a lot of them weren't actually there. Probably about half of them had been allowed to buy out their service. So they were supposedly stationed in Mosul, but if they gave money to their officers, they didn't have to go up there. And then the officers who were in it to make money certainly weren't going to, like, make Custer stand in Mosul, so they disappeared. And then the enlisted men looked around, the ones who hadn't bought out their service, and there's no officers around, and half of their guys had never shown up. And they said, well, I'm damned if I'm dying up here at the hands of angry Sunnis. So ISIL did take over. And then it took over other cities to create, it had already taken in January Fallujah. But again, these are political takings. There's a military or a guerrilla military element to them, but they're primarily political. And then they betrayed their new allies. So the Baathis and all those guys that made a deal with them, the armored convoys would come in the middle of the night and start taking them away. So the Baath officers have been executed by their former allies, the ISIL. Tribal leaders have been executed, and so forth. And so I think that the ex-Baathists thought we can handle these guys. They're a bunch of, you know, rural fundamentalists, and once we get rid of the government in Mosul, then we'll take over and we'll kind of subordinate them. But it's happening all the other way around. Then the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, as they had styled themselves, was an Iraqi, Ibrahim Samarai, who styled himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But he was just like, he had a PhD in Islamic studies from Baghdad University, and you know, from the 90s. I don't think Saddam Hussein probably put a lot of money in that department, so I wouldn't expect its standards to be that high. But he took it into his head to declare himself a caliph. The caliph was a kind of medieval Sunni institution analogous to the papacy in Roman Catholicism, but with both a temporal and a political role initially. Ultimately, the political role was taken away by kings. in any case, I mean, you know, this was a big deal in the press and so forth, but nobody takes this seriously, or almost nobody in the Sunni Arab world. I mean, it's not like people in Cairo think that Ibrahim Samarai is a caliph. I told one journalist, it's like, you know, if you had a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan who declared himself the Holy Roman Emperor. He probably could get some people to believe it, you know. But that's the kind of thing that's going on. And if they didn't have their coercion and their tanks that they captured and so forth, people would just kill them. But then they did do very well on the battlefield, and they started moving towards the Kurdish areas to Erbil, and they have murder on their minds. We know this. I think the Obama administration really didn't want anything to do with Iraq. They got out of it. You know, Barack Obama is from Hawaii, and he looks out on the world and he sees, you know, Samsung in South Korea and Sony in Tokyo and trade deals to be had in the Philippines, and there's, you know, like $2 trillion worth of trade a year to be had over there. And he looks at the Middle East, and it's just trouble. Every time you get involved in it, you know, people slap you. You bring the prime minister to the Oval Office, and you have a press conference, and he insults you in front of the journalists, or you get involved with them, and then they blow up your troops, or, you know, why would you do that when there's the Pacific Rim is much more fruitful? So Obama didn't want to have anything to do with Iraq, but he couldn't let Erbil fall to ISIL. That would, you know, be a massacre, and it would, I mean, for humanitarian reasons as well as political ones, it's impossible. So then he started bombing the ISIL positions and pushed them back from Kurdistan for now, and also from the Mosul Dam. You know, dams are potential weapons of mass destruction, and you really don't want a terrorist organization to be in control of a dam. So Obama, I think, without really wanting to, got back involved in all this. And so that's my story about it, and I'm sticking to it. And I think I'll stop there and take your questions.
Thank you, Professor Cole. I'm sorry, I've been dealing with fire hazard people. So don't move yet. We're still okay, but they will have to clear this up in a little while. But in the meantime, thank you so much for a wonderful and informative talk. What we're going to do is set up questions, set up a microphone for questions. If you have a question, please line up down here. And in the meantime, while you're doing that, I'd like to say thank you again to the History Student Association, who's been a tremendous amount of help and generous with their time. And I neglected to mention also my colleague in the Department of History and Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Ali Iman, who's been very helpful in organizing this talk as well. So, ready to take questions?
First of all, yes. First of all, I want to thank the department for sponsoring this. Really, I can't think of anything more time. The other issue would have been Ebola, but I think we've heard enough about that. I just want to ask Dr. Cole. Recently, the Turkish bombed positions of the PKK. What is the reluctance of the Turkish to side with the Turkish? They should, but why? What's behind that reluctance?
Okay, so you remember I said Iraq is a multicultural state, but those are very common in the Middle East, and Turkey is as well. So a substantial proportion of the Turkish population is actually Kurdish in the East and Southeast. And Turkish nationalism of the early 20th century was very hardline nationalism, and so they didn't like the idea that there was anybody but Turks in Turkey, and they insisted that Kurdish was actually a form of Turkish. This is the linguistic version of climate change denial, and Kurdish is very clearly an Indo-European language. But, and so they wouldn't allow Kurdish to be on television or to be used in schools, and they insisted on trying to Turkify the Kurds, and if the Kurds gave them any trouble, they sent in the military. In the 1970s, 80s, 90s, there was a dirty war in eastern Turkey between the secular Kemalist Turkish nationalist army and Kurdish guerrillas. Some of them, like the PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, were actually Marxists. So it's a little bit like, you know, the Zapatistas in Mexico. But there was this separatism idea amongst the guerrillas. And that wasn't, you know, a big movement, because most Kurds in Turkey, if you ask them in opinion polls, are very happy to be, you know, Turkish citizens. They wish they could be Kurdish Turkish citizens and not have to suppress their ethnic identity. But the Turkish army won the war against the Kurdistan Workers' Party guerrillas by the late 90s. But then when the Americans invaded and occupied Iraq, the guerrillas went over onto the Iraqi side and reestablished bases. And the Iraqi Kurdistan, which was semi-autonomous and was favored by the Americans, let them have the bases. So the Americans were in this very difficult position that they'd created a situation wherein the PKK threat to Turkey, as the generals saw it, was revived. The Turks wanted the Americans to bomb the PKK, but the Americans declined to bomb the country that they were occupying for this purpose. So they just gave the Turks the satellite information of where the PKK bases were and so forth. They let the Turks invade Iraq to deal with them occasionally. In any case, when the Syrian civil war got going, there's a corner of northeast Syria which is predominantly Kurdish, and they kind of declared neutrality. They didn't want anything to do with either the Baath government or the Sunni Arab more fundamentalist rebels. And the Turks are always afraid of autonomous Kurds, because their theory of it is that if the Kurds get too uppity, they might just declare independence in eastern Turkey, and so you lose a third of the country. And they're bound and determined that that not happen. So the current Turkish government sees itself in a very difficult situation. They don't want to do anything to encourage Kurdish political success, because they're afraid it'll blow back on them inside Turkey. And the Americans see ISIL as a much bigger threat than Kurdish separatism, but the Turks don't see it that way. So when ISIL chased the Yazidi Kurds up into the Sinjar Mountains, they were going to starve to death up there, or be massacred by the ISIL if it came after them. And it was the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the formerly Marxist guerrilla group, which has a lot of blood on its hands, which saved the Sinjar Yazidis. But the Turkish government doesn't see them as former terrorists turned heroes. They see them as just terrorists. So the Americans have been asking them to bomb ISIL. They won't do it. They've been asking them to the Americans use the Incirlik Air Force Base, which is a NATO base, to bomb ISIL. The Turks won't do it. But now the Turks the other day bombed the PKK. So the Americans think they're doing it wrong.
Where would control of oil fit into the current conflict?
Where would control of oil fit into the current conflict? I don't think it's very important so far. That is to say, the big oil fields in Iraq are in the deep south, in Basra. And they're very distant from where the fighting is.
Aren't there some in Kirkuk?
There are some in Kirkuk, but they're old and waterlogged and don't produce very much. In May, my recollection is that they were maybe doing 300,000 barrels a day. You know, there's one village in North Dakota that does that now. It's just, I mean, it's not significant.
So East Asia looks more interesting.
East Asia is where the action is, I'm telling you. If you could just avoid having anything to do with the Middle East. But the oil plays into the story in the sense that the Turks built some small refineries for Syria when they were having good relations, and ISIL captured them. And so it was refining oil. And, you know, crude oil is not worth anything. Like if I brought you a bucket of crude oil and I said, I'll give this to you for $10, you wouldn't buy it from me, because you can't do anything with crude oil. But if I bought you a bucket of gasoline and I said, I'll let you have it for $10, it would be worth, 30 or 40, you would buy it. Well, that's what ISIL was doing. They were refining the crude oil into gasoline and kerosene, and then they were selling that on the black market to Turkey, to the Syrian government, to Iraq, or whoever would buy it. The Americans seem to now be bombing those refineries, so that source of income is not long for this world, apparently.
Thank you very much.
I did some research last night prior to this event, and I've been reading some articles from some journalists from the UK and all those other foreign English-speaking nations, and I came upon this notion that Western imports are now joining the cause of ISIL. Could you shed some light?
Oh, yeah.
Because if you haven't noticed, I don't know if you've seen any of the beheading videos, but the dude that's doing the decapitation, he's British.
Yes.
So he's probably like an import, his name is John.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could shed some light
Sure.
on the imports.
Sure. Well, the British government at the moment is a conservative government headed by David Cameron. And one of the problems for conservatives in Europe is that their constituents are racists. And they really mind that there are so many immigrants around. And they'll give speeches, they'll say, just go back and watch a newsreel from the 1950s, and you'll see they're all white there. What has changed? And so they haven't adjusted to globalization. It's been hard on them. And so there's now this party called UKIP, which is competing for votes with the conservatives, with the Tories, and actually competing fairly well. And so David Cameron is really worried about his right flank. He wants to play to the anti-immigrant sentiment. So he comes out and gives the speech that 400 young British men have gone off to join ISIL and that this is a security threat and so forth. It's just a way of beating up on the Muslims in the UK. There are now, the UK Muslim community has mushroomed through immigration and population growth. So there are roughly 3.7 million, almost 4 million British Muslims and in a country of 62 million. So they're quite a significant group, and they're the ones that the right wing of the Tories doesn't want there, and the people who vote for UKIP don't want there, and so forth, but they're not going anywhere. So 400, you could get 400 people to believe in anything. Remember there was that guy who said that we could catch the asteroid that was coming nearby if only we would commit suicide. And I can't remember, he got 25 people to do it. Caliph Ibrahim, I'm sorry? 39. Anyway, to support my point. So out of 4 million, it's not very many. So Cameron is grandstanding about this, and it's Islamophobia, it's just racism, and he's doing it to shore up his credentials on his right and to fight the next parliamentary battle against UKIP. And then the FBI came out and said there are 100 Americans, and again, these numbers are minuscule. It's not an attractive organization for most people. I think, some occupations attract certain kinds of people. So terrorist organizations attract sadists. And so there have been a certain number of those who've gone off to join it. But to say that this is an enormous security problem, or if somebody brought up about Ebola, now we're being warned that ISIL could infiltrate from Mexico and bring Ebola with them. So all three of the big issues could be just rolled up. This is a kind of political hysteria and racism, and it's unworthy. And I think David Cameron, who has an Oxford education, should be ashamed of himself.
So in terms of what the U.S. should do, there's this idea that they could choke off the funding sources for ISIL. Does that have any chance of succeeding? If Obama called you tomorrow and said, Professor Cole, I've seen the light, you're going to be my national security advisor, tell me what to do with ISIL, is there anything that has any chance of succeeding?
The trade trip to the Philippines looks promise. No. I actually think that the bombing of the ISIL tanks rolling towards Erbil, is useful. Whether politically or not you agree or don't agree with that, I mean, militarily that can be done. You could defend Kurdistan from ISIL from a conventional attack by ISIL forces, because ISIL is kind of a hybrid organization now. It's a guerrilla group, and it can operate as a guerrilla group, but now it has infantry and armor, and it sometimes operates like an army. When it operates like an army, you can kill it like an army. So that could be done. You could defend things from the air. But you can't take Mosul away from ISIL by bombing Mosul. You would just end up with a lot of rubble, which is what happened to Homs. I mean, the Syrian government got al-Qaeda back out of Homs and defeated the rebels there, but have you seen Homs lately? I mean, Swiss cheese has more substance. I don't see a military strategy here. I mean, the Americans' policy is, A, get rid of al-Maliki, who caused all this trouble, and that's only partly true. It's al-Maliki's party that caused the trouble, so they brought another member of the party as the prime minister. He's not, as paranoid or extreme as al-Maliki, but he's from the same party. So you're going to Mosul and saying, okay, now it's all right, you stab ISIL in the back and we'll give you the Shiite fundamentalist prime minister. That's not going to work. And then now they're saying, well, and you can't send the Iraqi Shiite army up to conquer Mosul. That would be like, in the medieval, or in the early modern period, enlisting a Protestant army to take a Catholic town. It's not going to make friends, and it won't destroy terrorism. So now they're saying, well, the Sunnis have to take Mosul back. But we went to the Sunnis and said, look, if you only turn on al-Qaeda, we'll pay you, and then we'll rehabilitate you, and then we'll give you government jobs, and you'll be integrated in the new Iraq. So they formed awakening councils in 2007, and they turned on al-Qaeda, and they did what we asked, and then al-Maliki said, no jobs for you. In fact, some of you guys look suspicious, I'm going to arrest you. And then al-Qaeda, you had turned on al-Qaeda. So you had this big red target on your back, and al-Qaeda killed a lot of them. So we're going to the Sunni Arabs again, and we're saying, well, if only you'll form awakening councils and turn on ISIL for us, we'll integrate you into the Iraqi government and we'll give you jobs. And so they're saying, it's like we're Lucy and we're offering the football to Charlie Brown. They're just not going to fall for it anymore. So I'm glad Obama's not calling me, and I don't see a good strategy forward here. And I think the one thing that he's got right is that it's not a problem that's going to go away tomorrow. On the other hand, it's not a long-term problem, because the Iranians don't want ISIL in Mosul, and the Russians don't want them there, and they're Chechens fighting, and the Jordanians don't want them there, and Damascus doesn't want them there. The Israelis don't say anything about it, but I'm sure they don't want them there, and the Americans don't want them there. So they have a lot of powerful enemies, and it doesn't seem to me likely that 5 years from now we'll be talking about Mosul as being in ISIL hands.
Thanks.
A twofold question, they're both brief. Can you address and expand on the importance of bringing Turkey into any kind of military alliance? It always seems that Turkey is the first country pointed out to be part of the solution.
Sure. Well, Turkey is a member of NATO, and the NATO Charter says an attack on one is an attack on all. So the United States feels as though it's threatened by ISIL, its interests are threatened by ISIL, American allies are threatened by it, that the NATO treaty sort of obliges the Turks to come in on our side. And it has worked before. I mean, they fought with the U.S. in Korea, in the Korean War. But this time they're skittish. So there are a number of issues here. First of all, there's the Kurdish issue and how it might play out. Then there's the problem is that the Turkish government had been friends with Bashar al-Assad, but since he started becoming a mass murderer, they don't like him anymore. And you know, he's had 10,000 people tortured to death, and he drops barrel bombs, you know, just barrels with petroleum in them, which explode when they land, on playgrounds. And so the Turks have decided he has to go, and you know, it's not an unreasonable conclusion. And a lot of the people that he's killing are Sunni Arabs, or are Sunnis, and the Turks are Sunnis, or at least 80% of them are. And the constituency for the Justice and Development Party is more religious Sunnis. So the fact that the Bashar al-Assad government is doing this to religious Sunnis doesn't play well among them. So the ruling party wants to roll back the Baath party. But there's no way that you can attack ISIL without benefiting the Syrian Baath party. So this is a conundrum for Turkey. And then if you're attacking ISIL, you're attacking extremist Sunnis, but you're still attacking Sunnis. How is that going to play with the right wing of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey? So from Turkey's point of view, this is a landmine. I mean, this is really a difficult situation, and this is why the best thing they could think of to do in the circumstances to bomb the Kurds.
Second question would be, it seems beyond the dissolution of the Baath Party that disagreement between Sunni and Shia almost is too much to overcome. And is there any Muslim leader or kind of leader in the Middle East who could be capable of bringing that, healing that chasm?
It's not much of a chasm. Sunnis and Shiites live together perfectly peaceably through most of history. There's nothing about the difference in religion that would necessarily cause conflict. Everything is contextual. It's like, you know, I'm a historian, so I can tell you, I think it was in the 1870s we had Protestant Catholic riots in places like Philadelphia over the form of school prayer. You know, the Protestants didn't want to have the Catholic school prayer and the Catholics vice versa. And so we just decided we won't have prayers in school. I mean, there are still people fighting against this, but that was the reason for going in that direction. Was we just depoliticized the issue. And then you don't have Catholic Protestant riots after that, for the most part. So it's the rules of the political and social game that either exacerbate those kinds of identity politics or diffuse them. And it would be fairly easy, and in fact, for most of Iraq's modern history, there weren't big conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites on that basis. But you go back and read the newspapers in Iraq in the 1950s, 1960s, there's nothing about Sunni and Shiite in them. It's all about landlords versus peasants and communism. You know, if you read, I read the American diplomatic documents, they almost never mentioned religion. They were just worried, you know, are the communists making progress there? So it was like, are they moving towards anti-religious radicalism of a socialist sort was the big issue. So, you know, it's because the U.S. overthrew the Baath government, which, I mean, I'm not defending the Baath government, it was horrible, but it really did incorporate politically both Sunnis and Shiites, although Sunnis were favored, and created a political vacuum. And into the political vacuum, political entrepreneurs have stepped who see an advantage in accentuating religious ethnicity as to form constituencies and to rally people around them, to make people afraid or to gather up new adherents. So it's all contingent. There's no particular reason why they can't all get along.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I would just like to get you, if I could, to comment on the rhetoric of caliphate here. And I should explain, I'm the history department's medievalist, so Islamic caliphate means something to me. But one of the great things about your talk is you kind of let us know how very complex the identity politics are in this region. Sectarian identity, ethnic identity, tribal or kinship identity. And I'm wondering about what sort of resonance in the region, the choice to declare ISIL a caliphate, whether it's positive or negative resonance, might have in this place with this multi-layered identity.
Sure. Thank you for the good question. Well, I don't think it has much resonance in the region, in the Arab world. But here's what I suspect is happening. If I have some pieces of it, and I'm going to speculate a little bit, but I think this is right. So in the 1880s, the Ottoman Sultan, Abdulhamid II, was worried about the inroads in the Ottoman Empire being made by the European powers who had a ploy that they would claim to represent the interests of Ottoman subjects of different religions. So the French announced that they were the protectors of the Catholics in the Ottoman Empire. These were the Republican French who didn't like Catholicism, but when they got out into the world, all of a sudden they were a Catholic power. And so they told the Sultan, you have to be careful in Lebanon. The Maronite Catholics were adopted by the French as their kind of protected community. You have to be careful nothing happens to the Maronites or we'll intervene in your affairs. And then the Russians became the protectors of the Eastern Orthodox Christians, and there are a lot of those. Most Arab Christians are Eastern Orthodox in the Eastern Arab world. And the British, the poor things, didn't have very many Anglicans to protect. They declared themselves protectors of the Druze, which is an offshoot of Ismaili Shiite Islam. And to this day, the guy outside the British embassy in Beirut is a Druze. Abdulhamid II decided to turn about his fair play, and that he would claim to be a caliph, which the Ottoman sultans mostly did not claim to be in any serious way. But he would claim to be a caliph, and then he would interfere with the Russian rule of Muslim Central Asia, and he would interfere with Algeria for the French, and every time they pulled this thing on him, he just turned the tables on them. And in fact, the French forbade the importation of Ottoman-produced Qur'ans into Algeria because they were afraid that it would give cachet to the Sultan under whose auspices they were produced. So nobody took this very seriously in the Muslim world, in the Arab world. After the Arabi Revolt in 1882, the British sent out a parliamentary commission, and they asked the Egyptians, did you rise up against your government having anything to do with the caliph? And they said, what's that? But the idea of the Ottoman Sultan being the caliph actually had some resonance in British India. The Muslims, about a quarter of the inhabitants of British India were Muslim, and they felt, put upon. They were surrounded by a Hindu majority, couldn't have a good hamburger. The British were dictating their laws and so forth. And so the idea that there was a guy out there who would represent their religion and was powerful and so forth appealed to them. So they started what was called the Caliphate movement. And actually Gandhi got his start in politics by supporting the Muslim Caliphate movement during World War I. They were really afraid the British would abolish the Caliphate if they defeated the Ottoman Sultan. And then the Turkish Republic did abolish it. And so there's this strain in Indian Islam of nostalgia for the Abdulhamid II and the era of the Ottoman renewed caliphate. And a group formed called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is not exactly a terrorist group, but soft on terrorism, and is very popular among some South Asian Muslims and in London, which demands that caliphate, the Abdulhamid II caliphate, be restored. It was abolished by Ataturk. And they talk about countries of the Muslim world as being provinces of the caliphate. And they had an influence on bin Laden, because bin Laden talked about the vilayat of Afghanistan, the province of Afghanistan, it means of the caliphate. And Mullah Omar of the Taliban, called himself the commander of the faithful, which was a claim on the caliphate, and he wore the robe, a relic attributed to the Prophet Muhammad in Kandahar and so forth. So this is not new. And this Ibrahim Samarai seems to be under the influence of South Asian fundamentalism, because in his inaugural speech, he quoted Abul Ala Maududi a lot. And I think it's Hizb ut-Tahrir thinking that has caused him to go in this direction. And maybe it has some resonance for that small sectarian group and for some South Asian, like the 400 young men who came from Britain, mostly they're like Kashmiris and things, right? So I think it's not Arab. I think it's, and I mean, it does have kind of resonance in Iraq because it was the center of the Abbasid Caliphate and so forth, but I don't meet any Arabs or read any Arabs who take it seriously.
So it's more a callback to the 19th and 20th century than it is to like the 9th and 10th.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And I think that, bin Laden gave a speech in which he said, we have destroyed the mightiest of their buildings. Damarna min azim mabanihim. And then he said, وَأَذَقْنَا بَعْدَ مَا حَصْلَ الْمُسْلِمِينَ خلال الثمانين سنة الماضية. He said, we have destroyed the mightiest of their buildings and we've caused them to taste a little bit of what has befallen the Muslims in the last 80 years. This was 2004. So what befell the Muslims in the last 80 years? A lot of people in America sort of were puzzled by this speech, what was going on. Well, 1924 was the abolition of the caliphate. So this is part of al-Qaeda ideology, is to restore the caliphate and unite the Muslims. And if bin Laden thought if the Muslims were all united in one state under a caliph, then they'd be a superpower, because you'd have Saudi oil and you'd have Egyptian person power and you'd have technology and engineers and then the Muslims couldn't be pushed around anymore, and the Europeans had very cleverly divided them up into these little tiny states like Jordan and Tunisia and so forth, and those should be just gathered up into one big caliphate. So this Ibrahim Samarai seems to me like a dime a dozen. I think he's just doing what everybody else in that movement is doing, but he's a narcissist, so he's putting himself forward with his Rolex and so forth. He wears a Rolex. This was a scandal, because when he came out and declared himself caliph and he gave his inaugural khutbah it was a Rolex. So people thought it's not Puritan. The fundamentalist Muslims are like the Amish; they want to be plain.
We have until 2, so these are the last 3 questions.
Okay, thank you for your talk and also for the historical context. My question is, given a lot of the anti-Islamic sentiment, and especially in the Western world, the US and everything, I mean, with DHS memos that have come out, in the media, treatment of Muslims by people and also by police, FBI, things like that, and even in academia, how do we challenge anti-Islamic sentiment, not only in academia, but also outside of it?
Yes, prejudice is based on stereotyping people. So when you take the behavior of one person in a group and you attribute that to the whole group, that's a form of collective guilt and collective punishment, and it's always wrong. So we just have to stand up for the principle that you can't smear 1.5 billion Muslims with Ibrahim effing Samarai. And there are, as you know, many attempts to do so, but it's not, the form of it isn't any different than prejudice in general. I mean, it's very common in societies to stereotype minorities as particularly dangerous. Wouldn't it be the majority that was dangerous? So you're afraid when you see the minority person walking behind you, they're more dangerous? I mean, it's just prejudice. And so it's being done now to the Muslims, and there's political gain for it. A lot of politics in democratic societies is unfortunately about making people afraid of some group and then putting yourself forward as the person who would save you from them. And they used to do this with the communists. So what, were there 50,000 communists in the United States? Were we really afraid that that the great American GM and Ford were going to be taken over by communists? But Dick Nixon out here in California got his political start by trying to make Californians afraid that there were communists in their neighborhood and that who could save you from them was Dick Nixon. He might have to burglarize you in the process, but so in my view, actually, for the people who go in for this kind of very pathological politics, the fall of the Soviet Union was really bad, because then nobody was afraid of communists, and you can't be afraid of the Chinese communists. They're running Walmart. So, so then 9/11 gave them this other possibility, which is, in my view, much worse, because, I mean, scapegoating the communists was bad, and some people were actually imprisoned for thought crimes and so forth, but at least it wasn't racist. And now, you know, Islamophobia is just racism, and to make it the keynote of American politics is a real step backwards.
Thank you for the talk, Professor Cole. My question concerns the U.S. foreign policy interests in dealing with ISIL. I mean, from a political realist perspective, not necessarily with their humanitarian crimes or galvanizing anti-Islamic sentiment. I mean, what are the U.S.'s interests in the Middle East? Because I think they're rather reluctant to deal with ISIS because they are, it's like, in the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and they have, the U.S. has an interest in overthrowing Bashar because, I mean, I heard it's largely to help weaken Iran, which Syria is a patron of Iran.
Yes. Okay. So, what is governing American foreign policy towards ISIL in this region? It is now, it's very complex, because also at the same time that they are fighting Iranian influence in the region, the Obama administration has reached out to Iran and is negotiating with them and may, you know, they say that Obama, I don't know if it's true, hopes that sometime in his last 2 years he'll be able to go to Tehran the way Nixon went to China and that would be one of his foreign policy victories. So then is blocking Iran really all that important? And how would you fight ISIL in Iraq if you didn't have Iranian allies? So there's this little town, Amerla, which is Turkmen. They speak a form of Turkish there, and they're Shiite. And there was ISIL people in the area. The Shiites said they were being besieged, but at least they were in danger. And the Americans provided close air support to a Shiite force that pushed ISIL back from Amerla. The Shiite force consisted of the Badr Corps, which is the Iraqi branch of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and probably is still paid by them. The Mahdi Army, which used to kill the Marines. The Asa'ib Ahlul Haq, which kidnapped the Marines. And some Iraqi army troops were mainly from those other groups originally. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Special Forces, the Jerusalem Brigades, the commander of which was on the scene, Qasem Soleimani. So you had this motley crew of Shiite, what are coded by the State Department, terrorist groups, advancing against ISIL with U.S. F-18s flying missions to give them support. So in such a situation, realism, schmealism, it's every man for himself.
So essentially, it's just hard to unravel, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's step by step and sort of whatever works in the moment. It's very ad hoc.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Colbert.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you for coming, taking out your time, and coming to Cal State Long Beach and giving this lecture. I do believe that it is fitting to finish lectures with somewhat controversial questions. So, Christian Hoffman wrote in a commentary piece on Der Spiegel Online where he stated that the Iraq War and the rise of ISIS have demonstrated that the alternative to dictatorship isn't always democracy, but rather anarchy and civil war, and argues that dictatorship and stability, being the lesser of two evils, should be preferable over individual freedoms and unimpeachable democracy. And I was just wondering if I could get your opinion on that.
Sure, thank you for that question. It's a wrong way of thinking. I mean, if if the African National Congress had gone after the whites and punished them and pushed them into rebellion, and you'd have a civil war in South Africa in the 90s, then there would be somebody publishing their Spiegel how it would have been better if the apartheid regime had just stayed there, right? So it's not the outcomes that should determine our morality. I mean, sometimes you save someone from being hit by a bus and the person goes on to rob somebody and goes to jail. You think, well, you know, why did I do that? Well, that's not the right way to think about things. The right thing to do has to do with your moral position, not with outcomes. So it's just a wrong way of thinking. And the real problem is not that the Baath government was overthrown. The real problem was the policies that were implemented in the aftermath, which exacerbated ethnic conflict.
Please, let's thank Professor Cole. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at other events as well. Have a nice day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.